Australia is in recession with a GDP down 7% and with worse to come. Over 1 million Australians are unemployed, millions more on JobKeeper. And farmers are finding it hard to get fruit pickers, and tradies are finding it hard to get apprentices. Australia's borders are closed, and in coming months, tens of thousands of overseas workers will be given exemptions to work in parts of Australia with some of the highest unemployment rates. Tonight's Mundine's Truth Talking is, why can't Australians pick fruit? To discuss tonight's topic is Gemma Tognini, of course, a writer, media commentator and businesswoman. James Williams, advisor to government on economic and business development. And of course, Steve Baxter, the shark of the Shark Tank and entrepreneur. Unfortunately, we're Jillian Kilby, who had to pull out at short notice, but we'll have a great discussion anyway. So I want to raise the first thing. We're looking at in COVID-19, massive unemployment at the moment, businesses going down the gurgle, and we're seeing a whole lot of unemployment around the place. But at the same time, we've got people who are, we're importing from overseas, and yet into areas where there is large parts of Australia with large parts of unemployment. So, I just find that quite bizarre. What do you think about that, James? I think you're on mute, mate.
Yeah, it was $5, mate. You're on mute.
My apologies.
You got to shout the drinks.
Asking a question in regards to why we
can't in regard to that why are we importing people to work in jobs where we've got so many people out of jobs?
Well, I have a very interesting view on this. I think that I think it's one of those things that it's a great sign of success, but it's also a great sign of failing in terms of our economy. And I think we see that through generations as well. I mean, you look at migrant families, you look at Indigenous families. The thing that's interesting about it is that the kind of things that our forefathers were willing to do, the next generation is not. And the broader issue is, how do we enmesh, or how do we sort of, I suppose, develop within individuals the same sort of philosophies and practices that they're willing to do things and take up some of those really fundamental principles that I think somehow we lose along the way because we have it so well. So I suppose in relative terms, Australia's economy we experience a significant level of affluence that other parts of the world don't. And as a consequence, sometimes those sort of, those types of jobs, if you like, particularly fruit picking, that has sort of featured in a number of articles that I've just read, just recently. People won't go and pick fruit, and on that parallel, you think about Indigenous communities where we talk about unemployment and everything else. I find it even more confusing that we're not even thinking about how we develop mobilisation programs for people in Indigenous communities, to go and pick fruit the way that we would do with, someone from Vanuatu or East Timor. But it is a very interesting question. It's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, Steve. Look, this is COVID-19. This didn't just appear just because of the virus. It's been around for a while. In previous years we've had about 90,000 people we're looking forward to work in the agricultural industry and horticultural industry, and we've also had something like 10 to 20,000 people who are in the hospitality industry. Now this has just really pushed it along. So it's not just about just about COVID. It seems to be a fundamental problem within Australia.
Yeah, look, my last job before I joined up as a soldier at 15 years old. My last job before that was a part-time fruit picker. Well, I actually carried the boxes for the people picking the fruit. I wasn't even qualified to pick fruit, but I still did it. Look, it's just hard work, right? There's easier ways to make money, I think, and basically if you can sit at home and be paid to watch Netflix all day, then who wouldn't want that as a job as a 16, 17-year-old, right? So it's disappointing. I agree totally with the first chap's name, sorry, who spoke before with his points about Africa.
James.
I think James. Yeah, it's an awesome facet, the fact we can actually do that. Our kids can do that. We have a society that's rich that we can do that, but at some point it gets bad as well. So we haven't had enough of the, I think, the cyclical up and down that's actually reinforceable. I think I said last session that when I first started in business, we started in 1994. We just come through a couple of recessions that the Muppet Labor government said we should have. And we had what I would describe as a very compliant workforce. It was a good thing. We all, we could swing behind the team and get into it. Nowadays, you need slippery dips and chupa chups and cakes and fridges full of crap, excuse me. So it's great, we can do that, but I think we're going soft because of it.
Yeah. Just before the show started, Gemma, you were speaking about some horticultural business in Western Australia, which went through a number of problems.
Oh, just news has just come out today, Warren. A very established fruit growing business in the foothills of Perth, probably about 30 minutes from the CBD, has announced it's going to be destroying more than 1,000 of mature, healthy trees simply because it won't have the staff or the people to pick fruit, and it doesn't want to have fruit go to waste. And I mean, the first place my mind goes to then is, well, then there's going to be less supply and costs will go up and all of that kind of thing. But, thoroughly agree with what Steve and James have had to say. To add to that, I think, we are the victim definitely of the success of our parents and our grandparents' generations, if you're talking about old people like me in my late 40s, but we're a victim of their success and their desire for us to have better lives. But I also think there is a great reckoning. We're in the middle of a great reckoning with the generation that has decided that hard work was something to be ashamed of, that hard work was something that we wanted to shield our children from. I mean, I grew up, I came out of university in 93, end of 93. The tail end of the recession we had to have, and I worked 3 jobs for cash. I cleaned other people's toilets. I was a tutor, and not a particularly good tutor, and I cleaned houses, and I was a dish pig in a restaurant until I got a full-time job, and it was never a question. My dad came to Australia on a boat. It was never a question of getting handouts. It was like there's jobs to be done, and they're menial jobs, and work brings dignity. So for our family narrative, that was very much the thing you did. And in that space where I guess my generation had children and raised those children in a place of more privilege than we had growing up, something's been lost in our culture, in our work ethic, and that's the intangible that I believe is at the heart of this problem. So it's not, I don't think it's a case of, we need to perhaps have this program or that program. That might help from a structural perspective, but what is it that makes a person go, I haven't got any other work at the moment and I would rather be picking fruit than be on the dole?
Yeah, that's one of the things. And it's not only just on fruit picking and that. I'm just looking at a list of, that the Department of Employment put out, which is where the shortages are. So it's a wide range of occupations, including bricklayers, hairdressers, glaziers, locksmiths, panel beaters, arborists, chefs, and of all things, pastry makers. And a further 12 occupations have also had recruitment difficulties and regional shortages. And I'll give you a good personal example. We were looking at hiring about 5 apprentices. So you're looking at 3 diesel mechanics, which we were going to train into vehicle mechanics, electric vehicle mechanics. 2 electricians. Sorry, my maths don't add up. There's 6 people, and 1 air conditioning and refrigeration mechanic, and we only actually had one applicant. And when he turned up for the interview, he said, "No, I can earn more money, not on the dole." So that raises an issue about how we structure some of these things. Now, James, I know that there a paper was put out by Noel Pearson in regard to attracting apprenticeships and that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier this evening in a discussion with Warren. I said, look, there's an interesting, many years ago when sort of Noel talked about the sort of the sort of welfare model. One of the issues that he identified in his paper is the fact that, and I thought it was quite revolutionary, because at the time, you're talking about, I don't know, probably about 10, 15 years ago. And suddenly there was a particular dialogue with government, because government needed to understand what is it and why is it that there wasn't enough incentive for people to actually go to work. And one of the things, and it wasn't innovative, it was just a simple observation, and that is that if you look at the welfare sort of trap, if you like, and this is, and like I say, I won't take any credit for it. You're basically, the welfare keeps you on this trajectory in a very simple plane that sort of it's just like a flat line. But it maintains you on that level, but it's just above enough that people can cope. They and human beings, being as adaptable as they are, they cope with. If you reduce you keep the wage at 25,000 or 20,000, 15,000, they'll find a way of coping. And of course, and this was particularly applicable to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and where we see welfare as being the significant source of income in those communities. The issue, of course, is that for you to be able to go and do a trade, for example, which is what Warren pointed out, you actually earn less money than if you are on welfare. And so the idea that he sort of championed in a lot of his in this particular document, and the name escaped me, I do ask your forgiveness, is that in order to get the long-term benefit of a qualification, and then of course to be able to engage in a particular industry, and then, over time, as you improve your capability, you earn a lot more money. And so over your lifetime, you earn, 10 or 100 times more than someone on the dole. But the reality is that the initial step of stepping down before you step up into that sort of trajectory of growth is the biggest sort of pitfall, is that there's insufficient incentive for people to step off the benefit of being on maintained on welfare, because behavior when individuals are stuck in unemployment, they're not long-term visionaries looking at trying to transform their lives. And there's probably a few, but when people are in that real cycle of long-term unemployment, and it could be intergenerational as well. The issue, of course, is that people don't look at it, well, if I'm going to step down, they see it as a disincentive rather than an incentive, because they're not looking at the 5-year plan, the 10-year plan. That's rather sophisticated, mature thinking. And so I think that there's a behavioral challenge for us, because a lot of the stuff that we do and the way that we address those things, and I do love that description. I may not necessarily agree with a lot of the prescription that came out of that initial analysis. But as I say, the key thing is understanding that behavior and why there's a particular trap. And I think that issue around the disincentive as opposed to an incentive for people to do particular things. So in spite of the fact that we see these opportunities, we see people simply don't respond in the way they ought to. And I think that's one of the big challenge for policymaker, but not just in terms of writing policy, but actually practically understanding how to actually develop real practical, mechanisms that drive policy thinking in a particular way that transforms behavior, because behavior is the activation piece that's not there.
Yeah. So, Steve, it was around about the 1980s when the massive push was to get people to universities, go through to year 12, go to universities, where previously you could go to year 10 and then go off and do a trade and work from there. Has this played a lot into this area that, everyone's looking at getting a university degree or something like that, rather than actually looking at some of these other areas of work, which in some cases, like I look at my sons, they earn more money than my daughters, and yet because they're tradies and my daughters went off to university.
Not my word. So like every year, my trade was as an electronics technician in the Army in 1987, we cleared $144 a fortnight back then. So that being said, everyone I serve with now who's still working in their trade would probably earn $250K a year plus. They're now the maintenance supervisor. So look, it's an amazing career having a trade. Once again, I'll come back to the point made previously about affluence. And isn't it great that we can offer all of our sons and daughters and kids the option for university? And so the opposite of that question is do we want to not let them have that opportunity? So I think that there's a point here about changing behaviour, and how do we make that more desirable? I think that to solve the short-term problem, and inject some humour into this, hopefully, is that you offer everyone in Victoria currently like only a 7-day quarantine if they go and work on a fruit farm, and we'll watch Melbourne empty into into the fruit growing districts as everyone wants to get away from them and actually get some sunlight. So to me, I come back to a market. The market can tend to solve a lot of these problems, and I'm trying to understand how here, but you have a perverse incentive in here enforced by government and almost probably politically immovable, to be quite honest. But in every crisis, there's an option. There's they never let a crisis go to waste. We've got a pretty big crisis coming now. We can't sort this problem out in the context of COVID and the self-inflicted gunshot we were giving us off in our response to it, and we never will. So this is our chance to solve it. I don't know how, because it's a biggie, but it's going to need double-digit unemployment in Western Sydney before literally anything in this country needs double-digit unemployment in Western Sydney before things actually change.
Yeah. So Gemma. So what do you think we should be doing about this? $64 question.
I'm so fascinated by the conversation because I, without being trite about it, it's a unity ticket. I agree with everything Steve said. I agree with everything James said. But for me, it keeps coming back to the intangible around the culture that we've built as a nation. We've become an entitled nation. I mean, some of the comments in the chat that have been coming through around, this aversion to hard work and aversion to physical hard work. When I grew up, everyone had a part-time job. Whether it was, a dish pig in a restaurant or checkout chick at the local supermarket or, gardener, everyone had a part-time job. It was sort of like a rite of passage and that kind of thing. And again, I just come back to this, what should we be doing? Well, you can't police parenting. You go, unless you're in Victoria, you can't police, couldn't let that one get through. You can't say to people, you will instill a good work ethic in your children. Does it come back to, as a community, how have we weakened the education system? How have we weakened the sense of responsibility for kids who, go up before courts and magistrates and things like that? I'm not saying throw them in the slammer, but in terms of as a culture and as a community, how have we eroded this sense of personal responsibility and this aversion to hard work? And to the point about it not being COVID related, I mean, again, you had Caroline DeRusso on your show a couple of weeks ago, Warren, and her parents are farmers. And as long as I've known her, she's talked about the fact that, so they're at Hyden, which is about 4 hours from Perth, sort of straight into the wheat belt. It's quite remote. It's near a little place called Wave Rock you might have heard of. But for years and years and years, they've struggled to get Australian workers to come down and work seed time and harvest. They just, for whatever reason, they don't want to do it. Some of the reasons are that they've been given is they don't want to be so far from Perth, even if it's for 6 weeks. It's too physically hard. They can get more money on unemployment benefits, a whole variety of reasons. But they've had a long stream of very willing, very eager, backpackers and foreign workers. So to me, as much as the structural can't be divorced from the cultural. And that's the tricky thing, because cultural matters take generations to change, don't they? They take generations to address, and it's a fundamental bedrock issue around what do we value as a community and what are we teaching our kids and what are we instilling in them. And Warren, I mean, I've seen you and heard you talk about the sort of the racism of low expectations, but take race out of it. It's the low expectations to what Steve was talking about before about welfare. Regardless of what race or gender or community you're from, when you become when you're told by a certain, government or political party that, welfare is okay, you're doing okay, you're just okay to be on welfare. And I had written in a column once, who in their right mind aspires to living a life on welfare. I don't necessarily believe anyone aspires to that, but I reckon that there's a cohort in the community who've been conditioned to think that's all they're worth, or that's all they're capable of, or that's all they're good for. And again, that speaks to that cultural piece of the puzzle, or that values piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, well, I just like to, when you look at countries like Germany, where, a lot of their CEOs actually did a trade. They did a trade, then they went to university. And it reminds me back in the good old days, go back to the 60s and 70s, where a lot of the executives of some of these mining companies, like when you went to BHP, you actually went to Newcastle Steelworks. You worked on a trade, and then you went into the university and did your engineering degree. So what I'm trying to say is, how do we sex up that sort of that trade area, because we are struggling to get people into trade. One of the jobs, when I was working with AGL, and we used to import welders into the country, and this is back in the 90s. And we were paying them about $6,000 a week in the 90s, and yet you think people would be tripping over themselves to get that type of work, but no one did. And so, how do we make it that so we get people to find it as a job, a career, something to do?
Yeah, a good word will still cost that too, I reckon. So I can give you an example of someone who's actually done it. So why don't we hold up some role models? So there was a chap who was a young Army apprentice carpenter. His name is King Gillespie. He ended up being Chief of Staff for the Army, joined 15 years old as a boy soldier, worked his way through to, as a bricklayer. He was actually an apprentice bricklayer. I had no idea they had apprentice bricklayers at the time. He ended up being head of the Army, and he's still very active in business and community life as well, I believe, in Sydney. Although he's from Bridgerton, Queensland, so I can't hold the Sydney stuff against him. So we need to find these people and sort of say, look, this is actually what's possible. I don't know what else to do aside from each being better and each being responsible. I mean, at some point, we've all got to take our minute level of responsibility. We have to own up and say, well, if I can change something in my purview, therefore I should do that. And so I'll change what's in my grasp, get out there and do it, and lead by example. More of us need to do that instead of pointing. And generally, I blame myself here as well, but more of us need to do that.
Yeah. So there's a number of issues that we could talk about that could stifle some of these things. Now, is it actually the welfare payments that are causing the problems? Because we've seen in the 70s, when Aboriginal people accessed welfare, they come up with the term sit-down money, and which meant that because the elders who worked on cattle stations and were hardworking, very tough people, they just couldn't believe you got paid to do nothing. And so that's where they come up with the term sit-down money. Is that part of the problem, especially now with COVID, where they double the money? James?
My thinking around, look, I think welfare is one part of the problem. It's an interesting piece, because I think the bigger challenge that we have is that we probably don't do enough to understand the barriers on the supply side, like in terms of labor supply, why people, understand what those barriers are. As we were speaking, one of the gentlemen sort of popped up and said, look, I'm in Perth, and, I'd go and pick fruit, if you share numbers and whatever. But, there are people out there. I think the bigger challenge is what is it that actually stops someone? And is it just the fact that welfare becomes just one of those sort of pragmatic excuses that you just, this is what we do, that people are not willing to get up off their couch and go and do something. But I think that there are some practical barriers in place, whether that's the psychological one or there's physical barriers that we need to probably better understand on the supply side. On the demand side, I think the bigger challenge for jobs is, and particularly those industries where they're least attractive, is that there should be industry associations that are more sort of positioned around how they understand to, I think there's an attraction piece that's really missing. In any kind of industry, in any sort of job, we need to understand what it is, what's the value proposition, for for that sort of for that job or that opportunity, that industry, and why people should join. And we don't do enough to understand and then package that up so that we understand how to put the demand together, if you like. And for me, it's always been very simple: is that there's this asymmetry problem between what's available, what our supply, what's available in the market in terms of our supply, and what the opportunity or demand is. And we simply somehow don't do enough on both sides to understand how they marry, because marriage is where you get the value, is when you've got people coming into those opportunities, accessing them and activating by doing whatever they're supposed to be doing and getting benefit or value, which is a job, and the employer, the industry benefits from that resource. And of course, I just think we actually don't think about it like that enough. And then pragmatically try to solve it. Because if you think about the fruit picking problem, that's all they've done, but is that they've gone, okay, well, labor's cheaper and there's more willingness over, in terms of what labor supply is over in Vanuatu and East Timor. But
Steve, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. Is it a regional problem? Well, I mean, you mentioned smash repairs before. I find it hard to believe you can't get decent panel beaters, but it's obviously true. Is it mostly a regional problem? Because I mean, there's this link to the bigger issue we've got in Australia with respect to the dislocation between cities and regions, and the fact that that because of our homogenisation of our society through the basically through Canberra collecting all the taxes and the state spending like drunken sailors, and they get very little opportunity to therefore bias regions, because constitutionally Canberra can't do that. So that if states had more control, they could then actually more fine-grained dedicate policy, i.e. money and spending and taxation or lack of taxation, to drive population out there. So the fact we're concentrating in the city and we've homogenised the death out of ourselves, we're basically boring, and the only choice you get where to live is what climate you want to actually put up with. So if we gave more responsibility back to the states, we could then actually bias regions where there's lack of labour, for example. I think this is a symptom of a larger problem, in the fact we've fundamentally got a broken fiscal federation.
I should say you can jump in any time if you want to, if you got an idea or just want to say something, and that. So Gemma and James and that, just do that. Look, it's to me, it's you talked about culture, Gemma, and you do find in a lot of regional areas, and even in Western Sydney, you go to suburbs in Western Sydney like Sydney, like Claymore, and you have 2-3 generations of people who haven't had a job.
Wow.
And that's not an Aboriginal community. This is in Sydney,
Yeah.
And so when you go there, you think you've gone into some of these remote communities because of that. So how do you do that? Because as you know, the first teachers you have is your parents. How do you raise the issue of culture? How do you change that?
You're hitting me with all the easy questions, Warren.
That's why I wanted you on the show. Yeah.
So funny. Listen, I'm genuinely fascinated by that question. Obviously, because my on my father's side of the family, at least, they're like many hundreds of thousands of Australians, post-war economic migrants, where the narrative was, this is the golden ticket. A life in Australia was the golden ticket, and that was very much passed through our family narrative growing up. But I am aware that not every economic migrant from Italy or Europe was an upstanding citizen who worked their way to a better future. I'm aware of that. So I think there's lots of things at play without sort of overreaching into people's lives and front doors. Then in the same way that we provide parenting support to new parents and parenting support programs, well, here in Western Australia anyway, is it such a stretch to say that there should be, identifying people at risk if there is intergenerational, like long term? I mean, we have the data, surely. Is there not a way that we can intervene and devise some way of intervening? But also, who has the courage to tackle welfare reform? Who has the courage to tackle the bit, like it's about as exciting as, or it's about as popular as, having dysentery on a camping trip. Nobody wants to come up and go tax reform or welfare reform or any kind of reform, because nobody likes change. Change is painful.
Yeah.
And whenever you say the word reform, someone is going to say, you're taking away. And that may well be the case. But if you look, when I think about reform, the thing I remember most, because it was just such a formative period, I was still a journalist at this stage, a very young journalist, was the post-Port Arthur gun reform. Say, yes, still young.
Still young.
The post-Port Arthur gun reforms that Prime Minister Howard brought in, and I have this vivid memory of him standing up in front of a swathe of angry farmers, and I think we now know that he was wearing a bulletproof vest at one of those events. But when we talk about reform is painful and nobody wants to do it, but it takes courage. And to me, that is a missing link in our governance right now, in our government. Who has courage to stand up and say, no more JobKeeper over there? Who has courage to stand up and say, no, Mr. Andrews, we're taking away your COVID? I mean, who knew they used faxes still? Who even knew faxes were around still? My God. We're coming back to this, Warren. Who has the courage to reform the welfare system and go, we need to start looking at tangible outcomes and stop worrying about feeling good?
But I'll go one step further. We actually, given the structure of how those payments occur in Australia and the Constitution, we can't actually do that. Canberra collects it, and they cannot discriminate between states. They can't say that, okay, there's a ghetto in Western Sydney, or there's an Indigenous issue up here specifically, and use those payments meant for all Australians. There's obviously Aboriginal welfare, and there's other dedicated things, but as a welfare issue, you can't do that. You need to devolve that back. More power closer to the people is in the medium term is never a bad thing. In the short term, the politicians will stuff it up, but an election or two will fix that. So if we can devolve that power back, I'm a huge fan of having who spends the money should collect the money, and they should make the case to people about why they're collecting it and how they're going to spend it. And that doesn't occur at the moment. That's why we're seeing 60% of JobKeeper being spent in Victoria, and that madman Daniel is doing what he's doing. So if we can do that, then you could then say that this community, the state governments who constitutionally are not constrained, can say that's a problem, whether it be Western Sydney or whether it be Doomadgee or wherever it might be. Let's actually work on that with real reforms. Right now, you've got to spread the reform across all of Australia, not discriminate. So we are structurally not set up to do it.
Well, gee, you chucked a wild one in there too, taxation reform.
Yeah.
That's another courage. I remember Malcolm Turnbull talking about everything's on the table, and then a couple of weeks later, after he got beaten up, he said it's all off the table now. But those things can help. I'll talk about the experience that one of the things that the mining industry did, and it was through Andrew Forrest with the VTech approach, which has had a sort of like a marine approach. We never leave anyone behind. So they'd take a person into the training centre. VTech stands for Vocational Training and Employment Centre. And the idea, this is what they set up on mining sites, and so working with the local Aboriginal communities and other groups within that area, the local area, they'd go, okay, what are the issues? That's stopping you from work? And that would be drug and alcohol issues, or there were domestic violence issues, or there were housing and accommodation issues. There's literacy, numeracy, education issues. There were licensing issues, the whole wide range of things. And then they just packaged it up and said, okay, we will run you through this course, this 26-week course. You go through that program, and at the end of it, we guarantee you a job. And that was very successfully run. You had you look at the mining industry now. There's over 6,000 Aboriginals working in the mining industry, nearly 7,000, and you've got people who have set up businesses, Indigenous people who set up their own business. So you not only can get a guaranteed job, but if you've got a business idea, then they'll also support that. And one of the things that I saw was on one of them, Cloudbreak, it was in the mining site, because of dust issues. And that what they did was that they set up a nursery that people went into those nurseries, and it was a very successful program. I saw people. In fact, there's this woman I met who escaped from a domestic violence situation in Perth and went up into the Cloudbreak there. Hadn't had a job for 12 years. Single mum now with a couple of kids, and they put her through the program and worked with her and helped her. 4 years later, she was the supervisor of that nursery, and they were out there doing a whole heap of work on that. So is that? Is that a way of actually sort of breaking this cycle and changing people's culture in this way?
I think so.
I can't really talk to the Aboriginal stuff, to be honest.
Yeah,
I do remember.
but this is for anyone.
Very,
One of the things we discovered on this thing was it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're Aboriginal, Greek, German, as long as the same thing. It was the same thing.
well, I was going to reference Noel Pearson. Probably the memory of my earliest political awakening was listening to Noel Pearson speak around the issues about Aboriginals not being able to own their own lands and therefore use them as risk capital in ventures, and then being tied to essentially an asset they can't utilise. As a businessman now, I find it hard to understand. Well, I understand why they do it, but I find it hard to see how it's helpful. So, so I think that on risk and reform and on structural issues, maybe that needs to be looked at, because I think it's black, white or brindle. Talent in business is so hard to find, whether it's male, female or whatever race, doesn't matter. You just back where you find it, right? It doesn't matter. So, so to have these people who have this prize or burden of their land and not being able to use that to advance their future generations, other than just to have their look at and sit down on, apparently. I find that's one that needs tackling, because what we've done for Indigenous Australians is nothing we should be proud of. I mean, we are working, but obviously the results aren't anything to be proud of, I should say.
Yeah, well, there are major areas in that. In fact, I had a Fin Review article this week expressing my views in regard to the Indigenous space. To me, it doesn't matter whether you're black, white, or brindle. These programs should be working for everyone, and so what we're looking at is what we see within the in the Indigenous space about getting jobs and investment. And that it's really about looking at regional and remote Australia as well. So how do we get jobs and get things, investments and businesses, and have a realistic approach? Because some of the government policies in the past were we put the horse before the cart. No, you always put the horse before the cart before the horse, and you'd have troubles, wouldn't you? And then you'd by saying we're going to have jobs, and of course, only jobs they had was government grant type jobs. And so when the government policy changed or when the grant ran out, that was the end of the jobs. So we should be looking at about how do we create those environments. This is what I think government's role is. The less government involvement, the better, I always say. The best part is how does the government create those environments? Through taxation, through those welfare reform things, saying, okay, like you said, everyone in Melbourne, get on a train and go up to the northwest and northeast and start picking some fruit, or getting those training type centres in place and getting people into those areas. I see that's the thing, and for government, and also work with the business sector in regard to, okay, what are the things? I just come back from the Bush Summit a week ago, and we looked at payroll tax, which is a regressive tax. It's a bizarre tax in a way, that you're taxing people for hiring people. That's a bit bizarre. But about when we look at, and so having discussions with this New South Wales government about, especially coming out of COVID, is how do we encourage businesses and to build and grow in these regional areas. And one of them was about lifting the threshold of payroll tax up to $10 million, or even suspending it.
But payroll tax is a percent of nothing in the tax structure. I mean, it's a state tax, and honestly, if you're looking at tax, it's vital. It's not vital. It's material, but it's at the lower edge of materiality. I'm sorry. You have far bigger levers that you can pull, which states don't get control of. I'm going to come back to the states. I just think we should just evolve income tax in setting powers back to the states, but the ATO will collect it. One central post office makes sense. Let the states collect it, because I can tell you right now that if they could do that, and then Queensland could say that everyone north of the tropical Capricorn and the top marginal rate is 35 cents per dollar, you'd empty Sydney and Melbourne into North Queensland. I mean, so if you want you want to give them levers they can pull, or they might say, whether it's somewhat Mount Isa, who really cares where it depends on the state, right? They've got no levers to pull. They've got this small lever, which is an annoying thing. Payroll tax is annoying, but it's not. It's at the lower end of materiality. It really is.
Yeah. Well, that was I just tossing it out there to raise that issue again. So, do you have any thoughts about this, James? If you're from the Torres Straits, what do you want to what do you think about how you encourage investment? Because at the end of the day, it is investment, and how do you create businesses and jobs?
Yeah, look, if you think about the Torres Strait and you think about regions like that, I mean, the biggest challenge they have is that the sole investor is government. And what we're not doing is actually thinking about how we leverage existing investment to drive value in a way that, well, or to do things that really create value locally. And so part of the problem is that we typically use the same levers. We deliver services, we provide goods, and you look at those sort of regions, all they are simply a place where there's a lot of investment going in, but very few of that investment is then being captured, if you like, by local businesses, local labor, and then ultimately that money doesn't get circulated, and so then it increases the cost on government to then draw it from the rest of the through taxation from the rest of the country to then continue to invest into those regions. And the smartest people are the businesses that are actually supplying into that region, because they're coming from some other region. They're going up there because there's no capability or capacity underneath. And so part of the bigger challenge is not just investment, it's actually the issue around capability. So, and so there's capability, there's investment, and the bigger piece is that those communities, you don't have a viable ecosystem where you've got individuals and businesses that actually can do the sort of things and leverage whatever investment's coming in, so they can capture that opportunity. And so ultimately, I think if we don't think in that sort of strategic way about what we're supposed to do in those regions, then ultimately it doesn't really matter, because those regions will remain poor and estranged from the broader sort of, because the economy is very fast paced, and opportunities and the way that we drive things is very fast. And so where you've got these challenges, we're not thinking tactically and strategically about how we deal with those challenges, because we don't have those principles up front where we think about it and we say, right, those regions matter. So what is it that we want to see them transform, leveraging whatever investment or whatever available opportunity, whatever industry is in that region. Have a long-term vision about the transformation, if you like, that we want to see in those communities. We don't set those sort of visions anymore, because we kind of assume that it will happen.
I don't disagree, but there's a foundational issue. We can't get there. As investors, we can't get there. This is an annoyingly hard country to travel around. And I own an aircraft, and I find it hard to travel around this country, for Christ's sake. So, let's look at foundational stuff. I actually learned to fly in the US, right? And every town maintains a local airport. It used to be like a 1960s B-52 base. It's quite an impressive local airport, to be honest. But they've actually taken over the running of it, because unless they do that, they will not get factories. They will not get business owners to come and visit. And these are all away from the major hubs in the US. So, and that's an extreme example. But foundationally, I would look at setting up a business in Torres Strait if I could sanely get there. Why is it cost me more to return fly from Brisbane to Moranbah than it does Brisbane, Vancouver? We have a fundamental issue with actually getting around this country. And this comes back to the regions again. It's a regional problem we're talking about. And the stranglehold that federal regulations and the organisations, CASA and Air Services, has on Australia, we need to be leveraging the hell out of it. We need to get around this country fast. There's no way knowing I'm going to put a large operation in Longridge or TI or someplace like that. It's going to take me a day and a half to get there. That is just. So if you're going to do some foundational stuff, it's transportation. You need to get the shiny bum bosses to and from there, back for a meeting inside a day. If you can't do that, then you're in trouble.
Try flying in regional Western Australia. Like, try flying from Perth to Kalgoorlie. It'll cost you, I haven't flown there for a little while, but one of my team, their family's from Kalgoorlie. They tried to fly there, I think last year, the year before, $650 return to Kalgoorlie from Perth. You can get to Singapore, you can get to Bali. Say again, you're muted.
No, how far is that?
Oh, Cal is, it's like an 8-hour drive, maybe a 10-hour drive.
Okay.
Like you're paying $350, $400 return to Bali on on a cheapie flight. I'm probably the only woman in Western Australia who's never been to Bali, full disclosure, but I'm okay with that. But, you know, like last week I couldn't get accommodation in Broome, but my return flight to Broome from Perth, it's a 2-hour flight, was going to be $850 return to get to Broome and back, a 2-hour flight. I can get to Sydney and back normal to Sydney and back sort of for less than that. So, you know, living in regional Western Australia, and to your point about investing in a state like this, I mean, it's cost prohibitive, it's expensive, it's regulated. We are, as a nation, fundamentally unattractive as an investment proposition.
Yeah. If you can't get there, and put your hands around the throat of someone who needs to have hands around their throat, to be quite blunt as a boss, you just no. I will invest where I can drive to. I can be there and back in a day. And until it's foundational. It really is foundational to getting investment in these places.
Yeah. So is that the demand, or is it too much regulations? Yeah.
In travel, regulations. Oh my God. Anyway, you know, so for a country so large and so sparsely populated and so dependent on aviation as we are, we've buggered it up totally. We truly have, because we believe that an aircraft never should crash. I hate to say that, but that's, you know, everything has a risk involved as well, right? No, everything has a risk involved, right? And so, you know, you can make an aircraft never crash. You'll just never be able to afford to fly it from Perth to Kalgoorlie. Excuse me. So everything has a balance in life, and we have no balance in the COVID health response. We're seeing what lack of balance is doing there, and we've had no balance in that for some time. It's a hard conversation to have, sort of saying we need to associate some risk with things. We do that when we jump in the car. We do that when we partake in other stuff, excuse me. So we're all aware of risk, and we make that decision as adults. So branded as Class B airlines, or this is a not quite certified airline, people might, you know, it might have twice the fatality, which means 1 in every 10 million if it's 5 million hours will be an accident, if you know what I mean. Probably similar to riding a motorcycle instead of a vehicle on the road. So, you know, let people assume their own risk, but for God's sake, stop layering cost on top of cost, because in regional areas, it stuffs it, and it's foundational for regional economy. Sorry.
Yeah, well, yeah, I was just talking to the chairman of Rex, and he was saying that some of these local government airports actually put up their fees during COVID-19 to replace the loss of money because there wasn't enough flights coming in, which is, to me, is an insane proposition. But anyway.
Well, if the mayor of Gladstone's listening, wanted to charge me $85 a seat to land and refuel in Gladstone so I can go there for lunch. Excuse me, it was about the dumbest thing they could possibly try. $85 for 6 passengers, $85 each to say, costing more in fuel. It's going to cost you less in fuel than the landing fees at bloody Gladstone Airport. They just honestly don't know how to actually help themselves.
Yeah. So
Warren,
sorry, James.
I was just going to say on that comment, on some of the broader issues, I think one of the things that's interesting about regions and some of these industries is that there's very little study to actually understand what is actually viable or feasible, and what the market could bear, if you like, and where the failure rate is and what that cost is, because some of these things are really marginal, and it's really left to a guessing game, and really industry leveraging to maximize and to survive, and then the consumer sometimes having to bear that. But we actually don't understand where, we don't have a really good narrative with industry and with customers to actually understand where, for essential things that really benefits everyone, where it's really feasible and where the market failure rate is, and then perhaps what government should be doing to pay, to subsidize, like a form of subsidy, an operating subsidy in some of these industries. I don't know, because my view is that I think that there are some things that we're trying to do in those communities that it needs some type of support, but it needs to be based on evidence. It can't be guesses, because when we invest in welfare, we throw money at things, and policy makers are really lazy sometimes. They just think about big shiny stuff and they throw money at it, but they actually don't understand where the costs are. And so I'm really interested in those really small regions where it's marginal, and it's marginal for businesses, marginal for people, for consumers, and everybody struggles. But nobody's actually come up with some thinking around hey, well, where's the failure? And if there is a failure, but what we really want to do is drive a certain behavior that it needs to be maintained, we need to understand where government can intervene and invest or pick up something, and the rest the market can actually bear. They can bear, like, and the thing I think about is like apprenticeships. When a child starts, an apprenticeship, they may not be earning enough to actually maintain themselves, but with really good guidance and parents that support them, parents may support them to 60% of what they actually need to maintain themselves while they're doing their trade. But all the behavior and everything else that the child does to actually attain or, that qualification means that the parents can actually continue to support them as they work through their trade qualifications so they can get to a point where they're qualified. But that's a failure point, because if we've got a child to go and take a trade and then live, and to support themselves, they wouldn't be able to do it. They actually need the support, and that's but good support, and the behavior thing is different, is that you can support a child and not ask for anything. Or in some instances, you can say, well, listen, while I'm supporting you getting a trade, what you should be doing is that you should be saving the money. You should be, putting some money into, spending, all of the sort of core things that you require to live on. And ultimately, it's getting the right behaviors. In the meantime, we maintain that support. So that sort of behavior is fundamental. As that child then moves into a position where they become qualified and they earn good money, they've got the foundations, the behavior is right. And I suspect that this is one of the big issues around welfare in a lot of communities, is that we're trying to solve big problems where we're trying to make some of these communities where they're marginal and they're not really, they can't operate, without worrying about the fundamentals, the behaviors, that if we don't solve the behavior and we took them into a really great situation where there was a boom, they would blow the money. And you see that in mining. People that haven't worked and haven't got the foundations and behavior, once they're earning big money driving dump trucks, spend money, and they don't acquire any kind of economic foundation. They don't own a house or do anything.
Footy players do the same thing.
Footy players do exactly the same. But I'm sitting here sort of high-fiving you, give me a yes, Lord, in church. I mean, it's exactly the intangibles that you're talking about. And as you're talking, I was remembering my own, like I started off as a journalist, like a baby journalist, on $18,500 a year full-time across shifts, living at home with my parents, paying board. My late father had gone through a bankruptcy. We were in no position. I paid board and I lived at home, and I didn't have an expectation. Again, it comes to this shift, this cultural shift. Cultural is probably not the right word, but this expectation shift because of this period of sustained prosperity. And, you've had a generation of parents who've gone to their kids, you know what, you don't have to do anything, darling, I'll do it all for you. And there's no resilience built, and there's no expectations. And, growing up going, my first car is going to be BMW. My first car was a canary yellow Mini Minor that I paid $500 for. The doors didn't lock and it had a hole in the floor, and I paid $12 in fuel for it, right? But I paid for it myself. And then I graduated to my mum's old Corolla and done 150,000 Ks. My point is, my expectation as that baby journalist was not to fly around the world. I had friends in my 20s who were doing that. And I guess for me anyway, it comes back to, there's these two parallel pieces, and one of them is the intangible, the cultural, the attitudinal, and then the structural reform that is needed, but without the courage, who is going to bring that structural reform to the table and actually have the grit to push it through?
Yeah. Well, I've just realised you've got no taste in colours for cars. But you're right. And I did my apprenticeship. I was earning $30 a week. Mum took $10 for rent.
Yeah.
Mum took another $10 and put it in a bank account for me. I was, up until I was 20, she had her fingernails all over that bank account, and the other $10 that's what I lived on for that week. So a third,
Yeah.
And that taught me about, okay, I've got to save money. I've got to do this, I've got to do that, and that was a learning thing for me. And also I learned I had to crawl to my mother if I wanted to get any money out of my bank account. But it's
those
it
were
is
economic fundamentals.
That's it.
Those were economic fundamentals.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, what crawling? Anyway, so the so look, the issue is about, okay, if we're really going to make a change, it sounds like there's a whole lot of structural stuff we have to do. Steve wants to reconfigure the federation. We need to look at a lot of cultural change, and we need to about how we can do it. But I'm not one of these people who thinks it takes time. I look at places around the world, and this is what I did. Rather than just looking at what Indigenous people did around the world, I looked at what other people did. So, like, for instance, I looked at South Korea, and in 1952, 53, after the Korean War, they were eating grass. They were starving. They were at this incredible basket case. And then by the mid-60s, there was an economic powerhouse. So I always wanted to know how people did that. And so it's about how we can get those right tools in place to let people do things. And let people get out there and do stuff, because I'm a great believer in less government interference and people doing things.
Warren, my late mum, she was going to write a book about her life, and I ended up reading it many years after she passed, unfortunately. And she talked about how her dad used to go out when she was 8, 9, or 10 and shoot rabbits to eat. Yes, because that's all they could do. He was a coal miner up at Ogmore in central Queensland. So we hadn't been bombed to death by the Chinese, and had the US and Chinese armies run over us 3 or 4 times up the peninsula. We were pretty close to that. I mean, so we had somewhat of that miracle too. I personally think so. I don't think we've since slipped, but I do think we had a miracle almost at the same time, if not maybe a decade phase shift.
Yeah, well, look, it made me think about it over the weekend because it was Father's Day, and so I went to my old scrapbook and I found some old photos of my parents, and I can't believe I'm looking at my grandfather. They were living in humpies. They were living in humpies, and then here we are 2 generations later. The people have been to university. They've got degrees. They're doing a whole lot of different professions and trades. I'm running a business. My sons are running businesses. So within that short period of time, so things can be changed. The thing is that we've got to put in place the right structures, the right mechanisms for doing that. Education is a massive key in this area, of course, and also you need to look about how do we get investment, because Australia as a country depend on investments, foreign investments and other investments. And how can we encourage people to invest in businesses in regional areas and get things moving?
Can I sort of say that I was confronted by a chap when I was in a trade mission, the Australia Week in China, when Milk and was both in Beijing. I was there that day, and I was confronted by this chap. We were talking about a similar subject now about what we do for our kids, and he said, "Well, it's simple. We've just got to tell them it's okay not to go to higher education and to do what they want."
That's right.
I had like a 1.5-year-old, so it was a bit of a confronting message. So, but I think we have to, as parents, we've got to let our kids be brave, and we're very lucky that they can have a couple of cracks at a career and eventually get it right, and let them find their feet rather than saying, "Go and do this. You will be a doctor or a lawyer or an art student or something."
Yeah. Do you know my late dad's career advice to me was, "Jemmy, I don't give a expletive what you do with your life. Just don't be half-assed about it. Whatever it is, do not be half-assed about it." There was never any, you must go. And my dad didn't go to university. He was a migrant. He finished high school, but, there was never any expectation. Now it's a given. And we talk about this, I'm just conscious of the time, but I did a journalism degree. If I had my time again, I probably wouldn't have. But the degree that I did, they dropped the entry level and they're pumping 200 kids a year through a journalism degree. In what planet is there 200 journalism jobs? I mean, it's actually criminal.
Yeah, and that's and you're right. It's about look, the worst thing you could do is have governments pick winners and losers. That's the worst thing you do. But at the same time, we've got to really address this this university thing. And you're right, Steve. You don't have to go to university. You can do other things. And even if you do go to university, which I did later, I did it as a mature age student. It was more about a knowledge factor rather than looking at a career thing, because I already knew what I was going to do. And I was doing it. It's about, okay, what am I going to pick up some knowledge about certain things? So I went off to the Elton Mayo School of Management at South Australian Institute of Technology. Now, do we need to be working with kids and just saying that, just relax, don't, I noticed there was a message there that, some kids, one kid wanted to be a baker, and his parents told him that he'd be a failure. Well, there's no such thing as a failure. I like my parents' attitude, which was, you work, you're feeding your family. It doesn't matter if you're the midnight man going out and collecting the dunnies, or you're, I don't know if a lawyer is a good example, but if maybe you're a doctor or someone else. They saw that as all equal. They saw that you're out there doing things and you're feeding your family, and that was the most important thing. Look, I've just been given the heads up that we have to close up now. Look, I'd like to thank you for your input today. And also, we've got a lot of comments we might send on to you later on, and questions and that. And but in the next 2 weeks, we're going to have a show, and I'm toying with the idea of looking about structural stuff and things that we need to look about. And a lot of these issues were raised tonight in regard to taxation, in regard to the federation structure, and about how we can do things to make a big difference. Anyway, thank you, James. Thank you, Gemma, and thank you, Steve, and thanks for the people out there listening.
Thanks, Warren. Great.